Imagine yourself standing on the Hawaiian island of Oahu on a lazy Sunday morning in 1941. The air is warm, still, almost dreamlike. The kind of morning when nothing seems capable of disturbing the quiet rhythm of island life. And yet, just beyond this calm veneer, history was already gathering strength. Even the recent relocation of the United States Pacific Fleet from San Diego to its new headquarters at Pearl Harbor seemed, at first glance, to be nothing more than a show of naval confidence, a peaceful reminder of America's maritime might. 7 of the nation's most formidable battleships lay moored off Ford Island, forming the now legendary Battleship Row, an iron wall meant to proclaim that American power was not to be questioned. But as the sun climbed higher, its light also revealed another sunrise, one heralded by the distant hum of an enormous formation of aircraft slicing through the morning sky on their way to carve their names into the chronicles of the world. Today, we will peer through rare, authentic images from that day, the day that reshaped history forever. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. At 6:30 a.m., sailors aboard the vessels anchored in Pearl Harbor stirred awake, beginning what they assumed would be a typical, uneventful Sunday. They carried out their routines, with no hint that fate was already counting the minutes. Within a quarter of an hour, subtle warnings emerged, signs that this would be no ordinary day at all. One of Japan's forward-positioned submarines had been spotted. The USS Ward, patrolling just outside the harbor entrance, noticed a periscope slicing through the water's surface. Acting quickly, the crew attacked the unidentified sub and sent a message to headquarters. When decoded, it read, "Sank enemy submarine 1 mile south of Pearl Harbor." Surely they don't mean sank, the communications officer muttered in disbelief. They must have meant sighted. And so, the critical alarm, the one that might have changed everything, was dismissed. Had that warning been handled properly, aircraft could have been scrambled, guns manned, and the fleet readied. The catastrophe looming over Pearl Harbor might have unfolded very differently. By 7 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft was already about 130 miles, roughly 210 kilometers, from its target. Now step back in time with me to April of that same year. Picture the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy as they rehearsed simulated assaults against American ships. With each practice run, their confidence grew, and the strike plan evolved. To fine-tune the operation, Japanese admirals oversaw the construction of an enormous-scale model of Pearl Harbor, a miniature battlefield on which every movement could be choreographed. But blueprints alone were not enough. They needed intelligence, real, detailed, precise. This is where Takeo Yoshikawa entered the stage, a young naval officer dispatched to Oahu under the guise of an ordinary visitor. You might imagine him blending into the crowds, looking no different from the tourists who wandered the island. Yet with nothing more than keen observation, he gathered an astonishing trove of information about American ships and the airfields that shielded them. The large Japanese-American population meant he drew little suspicion. Often he would sit quietly in a tea house overlooking the harbor, his gaze fixed on the movements of the fleet. Armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of American naval design, Yoshikawa pieced together a vivid picture of daily life at Pearl Harbor. His most daring act came when he posed as a tourist and rented a small aircraft, using it to discreetly photograph the harbor from the sky. These images, along with his reports, traveled to Tokyo, where they became part of the final blueprint for the attack. As the plan reached its final phase, Japanese strategists decided to deploy 2-man mini-submarines to slip into the harbor and strike at American vessels, while chaos from the air attack held the defenders' attention. 6 aircraft carriers would creep toward Oahu from the north, launching 2 waves of aircraft in the early hours. After refueling, a 3rd wave would cripple ships and shore installations, rendering Pearl Harbor unusable. An invasion of Hawaii itself was even discussed, but ultimately abandoned. Up until November, diplomats still scrambled to avoid war. On November 20th, Japan proposed withdrawing from Indochina in exchange for the lifting of sanctions and renewed fuel shipments. The United States refused, insisting on withdrawal from mainland China. With negotiations collapsing, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assembled a massive strike force of 6 aircraft carriers and more than 400 planes, backed by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The fleet sailed on November 26, 1941, determined to preserve the element of surprise. Despite the tremendous risk, Yamamoto ordered strict radio silence, with submarines sweeping ahead of the main force to reduce the chance of detection. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence, focused largely on the Philippines, intercepted Japanese messages, but failed to recognize that Pearl Harbor was the intended target. Warnings were issued repeatedly, but their sheer number bred complacency. Admiral Kimmel directed limited maritime patrols to the waters surrounding Pearl Harbor, convinced submarines posed the greatest threat. Lieutenant General Short strengthened security at airfields, wary of potential internal sabotage, precautions that some deemed excessive. A lack of unified command, combined with the belief that any Japanese assault would strike the Philippines, left Pearl Harbor exposed. On December 2nd, Yamamoto sent the coded order authorizing the attack. His prime objective was to destroy the American aircraft carriers. Yet fate intervened. The USS Saratoga was undergoing repairs, and the Enterprise and Lexington had already sailed on missions. Eliminating them was no longer possible. Still, the operation would continue, aimed at crippling the U.S. fleet and preparing the way for future battles, even without neutralizing those central targets. Then came the night of December 6, 1941, the last quiet night before the storm. American codebreakers intercepted a torrent of Japanese transmissions across the Pacific. Without the full context, they assumed Japan would strike Southeast Asia and the Philippines. No warning of an attack on Hawaii ever reached Pearl Harbor before dawn broke over Oahu. At 7:20 a.m. on the morning of the attack, an Army lieutenant dismissed a critical radar sighting, convinced the incoming signals represented a formation of American aircraft. Perhaps B-17 bombers expected that day. "Don't worry," he said. "It's a flight of B-17s coming from California." But anyone approaching from California would come from the east, not from the north. At 7:40 a.m., the first Japanese attack wave swept over Oahu. The serenity of the morning was obliterated by the thunder of engines and the rising panic across the naval base. From the southeast, from the north, from the very horizon itself, the planes surged forward like a dark swarm erupting from the Pacific mist. Imagine a nation unknowingly walking toward a storm it has long tried to avoid. That was the United States on the eve of December 1941, hesitant, resistant, clinging to the belief that distance could shield it from the flames consuming the world. Until that moment, America had carefully maintained a stance of non-involvement in the Second World War, largely because countless citizens at home insisted that this foreign conflict held no relevance for them. Why risk another catastrophe like the last war, many wondered. Yet behind this public caution stood President Franklin D. Roosevelt, striving to support the Allies without crossing the line that would drag the nation into battle. He dispatched supplies across the Atlantic and even transferred warships, walking a diplomatic tightrope so thin it sometimes seemed ready to snap at any moment. And indeed, what could be more precarious than this balance? Roosevelt warned that should Great Britain collapse, the Axis powers would dominate Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia, controlling the oceans, and gaining the strength to threaten the entire Western Hemisphere. Thinking not just of today, but of tomorrow, he declared to the American people, there is far less danger of entering the war if we help those resisting Axis aggression now than if we watch them fall one by one. His message was clear, but fate would soon speak even louder. Because everything changed that December morning when, as if summoned from the void, the Hawaiian harbor of Pearl Harbor erupted under a sudden and brutal Japanese assault. Picture the calm at dawn. Then, at 7:49 a.m., the commander of Japan's first attack wave gave the chilling order to begin. 6 minutes later, coordinated squadrons swept in, unleashing bombs, torpedoes, and relentless gunfire upon the Pacific Fleet and surrounding air bases. American gunners scrambled to respond, spitting out a heavy stream of ammunition. But across Oahu, the situation spiraled. Dive bombers struck U.S. air bases, including Hickam Field, the island's largest, and Wheeler Field, the principal Army Air Force fighter base. Men stationed there desperately attempted to mount a defense, but because their aircraft were tightly grouped together, the Japanese pilots saw easy prey. Meanwhile, roughly 15 miles, 24 kilometers, away at Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft locked onto the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The battle station's alarm wailed, a signal that something truly catastrophic was unfolding. Dull thuds grew into deafening explosions as a frantic message blared. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Many battleships, unprepared for such an onslaught, had only minimal power. Ammunition had to be hauled manually, adding to the chaos. Japanese planes swooped dangerously close to the ships, some pilots reportedly laughing as they executed their runs. The Americans had believed torpedoes could not be used in Pearl Harbor's shallow water, but Japan had engineered special shallow-running torpedoes, and the devastation was immediate. At 8 a.m., the USS West Virginia was slammed by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs, plunging the fleet into a nightmare. The attack on Battleship Row advanced with terrifying speed. Within the first 5 minutes, 4 battleships including the USS Oklahoma and the USS Arizona sustained direct hits. Moments later, a bomb pierced the Arizona's powder magazines, triggering a colossal explosion that claimed 1,197 lives. Flames, smoke, and burning oil transformed the surrounding water into an inferno. Young sailors leapt from towering heights into the sea. Some survived, others were swallowed by the chaos. By 8:10 a.m., the Arizona lay in ruins. The USS Oklahoma, carrying 1,000 men, was struck by 3 torpedoes and capsized completely as water surged inside. Over 30 sailors found themselves trapped, clinging to life in the darkness. Crew members tried desperately to halt the flooding stuffing clothing and blankets into vents, but the torrent would not stop. Meanwhile, the Naval Air Station at Kaneohe was engulfed in flames, yet its sailors continued firing back with everything they had. As the first wave waned, Japanese pilots made one last series of strafing runs. The devastation was absolute. Aircraft lay twisted and burned, propellers shattered, bodies scattered across scorched ground. Many American troops were overwhelmed, some furious, some shocked into silence, some weeping at the sight of the carnage. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave 170 aircraft swept in, divided into 3 attack groups and largely aiming at the same targets as before. But now the base was fully alert. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, turning it into a violent storm of smoke, metal, and frantic motion, like a flock of chaotic iron birds colliding in midair. After crippling Battleship Row earlier, Japanese pilots now redirected their fury towards ships at the shipyards. Destroyers, including the USS Cassin and USS Downs, suffered heavy damage. Positioned in Dry Dock No. 1 near the battleship USS Pennsylvania, they were struck repeatedly, fires erupting as ruptured fuel tanks ignited. At 9:30 a.m., the Japanese targeted the USS Shaw. Several bombs hit the vessel, and the detonation of its forward magazine produced one of the most unforgettable images of the attack. While the Shaw blazed, the USS Nevada attempted a desperate escape into open waters. The second-wave pilots bombed the ship, heavily striking the bow and midsection. If the Nevada sank in the channel, it would block the escape route entirely, leaving the rest of the fleet trapped and helpless. In a final effort to avoid this disaster, the Nevada deliberately ran aground at Hospital Point, preventing a total blockade. By 10:00 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the Japanese strike force began its withdrawal. Admiral Nagumo, wary of potential American counterattacks and unwilling to expose his fleet to further risk, ordered a retreat. Though the assault had been devastating, key American assets, fuel depots, shipyards, remained intact, a factor that would later accelerate U.S. recovery. In just 2 hours, the toll was staggering. 21 American warships sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 253 military personnel and civilians killed. Yet many ships would later be raised, repaired, and returned to battle, including those that would help turn the tide in the Pacific. Most importantly, all 3 of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack, escaping damage entirely, a twist of fate that would become crucial in the later stages of the war. The attack resonated far beyond its military consequences. America had never before faced such a blow on its own soil, certainly not in the modern era. The raid demonstrated that Japan possessed not only advanced mechanized power, but also the ruthless resolve to execute an assault that bordered on terrorism, an act of sheer audacity and destruction. And emotionally, it shattered any illusion of safety. Americans who had long believed the war would not touch them suddenly realized the conflict had arrived at their doorstep. During the attack, 68 civilians were killed, with the vast majority of casualties belonging to the armed forces. A total of 235 servicemen died, bringing the final death toll to 2,103. Picture the scene. The island still shaking from the thunder of explosions, smoke curling upward into the Hawaiian sky, and amidst that chaos, something grim unfolds. Many of the civilian deaths that morning were not caused by Japanese bombs at all, but by stray American anti-aircraft shells raining down on Honolulu. Desperate, frantic shots fired skyward as defenders tried to stop the incoming attackers. Across the mainland, millions of Americans awoke on December 7, 1941, only to hear the unthinkable. Japan had launched a massive assault on Pearl Harbor. The scale of destruction sent tremors throughout the nation. Radios crackled to life. One voice in particular pierced the confusion. "Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii." You can almost imagine standing beside the reporter on the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building as he spoke. "We witnessed this morning from a distance a large battle in Pearl Harbor and a heavy bombing by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked and has suffered considerable damage. This battle has now been going on for nearly 3 hours. This is no joke. This is real war." Slowly, the full extent of the tragedy began to reveal itself. President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved with speed and resolve. On December 8th, just 1 day later, he stepped before a joint session of Congress and delivered the unforgettable Day of Infamy speech, a moment etched forever into the American story. "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, he began. A date which will live in infamy." His words rang through the chamber, through radio sets across the nation, into the hearts of millions. He reminded the country that the United States had been at peace with Japan, still in diplomatic conversation. looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. And now, without warning, America had been struck. With unwavering confidence in the armed forces and in the determination of its people, he asked Congress to recognize that a state of war had existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan since the moment the bombs fell. Roosevelt had been informed shortly after the attack began. Because Oahu's dawn arrived many hours behind Washington, it was early afternoon in the White House when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox rushed into a meeting between the President and advisor Harry Hopkins with the urgent message: Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt later recalled how calm her husband appeared outwardly, but she knew beneath that steady exterior he was seething. He had worked tirelessly to preserve peace with Japan. And now the manner in which Japan initiated hostilities, viewed as dishonorable by American leaders, only deepened his anger. Shockingly, Japan did not deliver its formal declaration of war until 7.5 hours after the assault was underway. Among the first people Roosevelt contacted was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose country had also come under attack. While Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor, they simultaneously launched assaults against British territories in the Far East, including Hong Kong. Churchill famously told Roosevelt, "We are all in the same boat now." As Roosevelt weighed what the coming days would bring, he confided to Eleanor that he believed Germany would soon declare war as well. He also warned her, echoing Yamamoto's own grim foresight, that the United States was not ready for the conflict it now faced. American industry would need time to shift from building refrigerators and automobiles to producing tanks, planes, and bombs. He predicted the nation would endure painful defeats before it could hope for victory. That evening, armed with her husband's candor and aware of the fear gripping the nation, Eleanor Roosevelt took to the airwaves for her weekly radio broadcast. Speaking to anxious households across the country, she sought to steady their nerves. "Whatever is asked of us, we shall accomplish," she declared. "We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States." While she addressed the nation, President Roosevelt sat with his secretary, Grace Tully, dictating the speech he planned to deliver the next day before Congress. That night, he and his cabinet met to examine the latest reports from Pearl Harbor. The messages were devastating. Casualties were climbing rapidly, and the loss, or crippling, of so many ships had struck a brutal blow to the Pacific Fleet in the very first moments of the war. Yet one saving grace remained. By sheer luck, the American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor during the attack. After a restless night, Roosevelt delivered his address at 12:30 p.m. on December 8th. Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, he said, a state of war has existed. Within an hour, Congress voted to meet Japan's declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous, save for a single dissenting voice. Jeanette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, and the first woman elected to federal office in the United States, refused to support the declaration. Even as colleagues pressured her and onlookers booed from the gallery, she remained firm. "As a woman, I can't go to war," she said, "and I refuse to send anyone else." Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the USS Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor on the afternoon of December 8th. As the ship glided slowly into the devastated harbor, the crew could see, with their own eyes, the wreckage and ruin they had narrowly escaped. The day before, a wave of aircraft had been launched in response to a rumored sighting of the Japanese fleet, yet came up empty. Now, stung by that false alarm and burning for retribution, every man aboard moved with a single-minded urgency. Refuel, rearm, replenish the carrier, and be ready to sail at once. Can you feel that tense energy, that impatient resolve? Across the vast Pacific, as word of the invasion of the Philippines rippled outward, one thought began to thrum through the minds of sailors, soldiers, and civilians alike, those present on far-flung atolls and those back home in the United States and its possessions, avenge Pearl Harbor. Fortune or fate had spared the American aircraft carriers that day, and that survival mattered more than anyone then could fully appreciate. It meant that Japan's hoped-for, decisive 6-month window, the one Admiral Yamamoto had calculated, would not end in conquest, but in contest. And by June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Japan would fail to turn that 6 months into victory. 4 of the very carriers that had taken part in the Pearl Harbor strike would be sunk by American air power, a blow from which the Imperial Navy never recovered, a stroke that would set in motion the slow unraveling of the Japanese Empire by 1945. Pearl Harbor etched itself deep into American memory and into the nation's strategic thinking after the war, especially as the Cold War dawned and a new, even more terrible weapon entered the world. Americans now feared not merely another surprise raid, but the prospect of a sudden nuclear strike. The country poured billions into early warning systems and intelligence technologies. It launched a sweeping rearmament program so that, unlike the vulnerability exposed on December 7, 1941, the United States would never again be caught flat-footed. In short, Washington adopted a far sterner posture toward the Soviet Union than it had shown Japan in the 1930s, determined to deter surprises before they could happen. Meanwhile, the map of Europe lay mostly under Axis shadow. Adolf Hitler, already waging a colossal invasion against the Soviet Union, made an astonishing move. On December 11, 1941, he declared war on the United States. Why did he do it? Was it bravado, calculation, or something darker? Hitler, convinced he had a historic chance to purge the world of what he perceived as the malign influence of international finance and Jewish control of economies, embraced a crusade rooted in monstrous error. He was also tied by treaty to Japan and saw Tokyo as a natural partner. Whatever his motives, the result was catastrophic in its scope. Without fully understanding where such a declaration might lead, he expanded the war into a true global conflict, and the United States found itself bound to fight on 2 distant fronts. One thing is to hurl the words, "We are at war," into the air. Quite another is to organize and sustain that war across oceans and continents. For America, the logistical challenge was staggering. To defeat foes in Europe and simultaneously prosecute war across the vast Pacific would require the full weight of the nation's industrial might and technical acumen. Every factory, every shipyard, every engineer and assembly line mattered. Never before in human memory had civilian courage, endurance, and steadfastness been so central to the war effort. Thousands of non-combatants around the globe were killed or maimed by enemy action. Behind every frontline victory stood a home front, working with quiet heroism. Think of the Pacific struggle as a grim game of leapfrog across an ocean seizing and holding islands as stepping stones. Each outpost taken extended influence across that vast lake. Yet alongside these small, bitter island campaigns raged great naval clashes, battles in which fleets and air arms collided for control of lanes and lives. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 stands out as a turning point. In the opening minutes, American air power struck 3 Japanese carriers, and by the battle's end, a 4th had been destroyed. Midway did not merely exact a terrible price in men and material, it heralded a shift, the start of a more assertive American presence in the Pacific. What would you have done, standing on that carrier deck as the engines roared and ordnance was loaded, knowing the stakes were nothing less than the fate of continents? Remember these faces and these choices. Remember that behind the maps and the calculations were human beings, grit and fear braided together. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching. God bless you all and see you soon.